So we had a column from you and Chris the other day that went in. It was talking about how Pierre Poilievre, or I guess I could kind of read into it, any of the leadership candidates could have an opportunity to really bring in some good policies of accountability through things like recall and referenda.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, the reason that it was addressed, mostly focusing on Poilievre, is just because that's essentially what he said that his campaign is focused around. Now, we'll get to that in a second, but Corey, let me just provide a little background. I'm sure most of your watchers and listeners understand what recall and referendum legislation is, but let me just really drive the point home. So recall legislation, it allows people to start a petition if they're angry at a politician, and if they get enough petition signatures, then they can force a by-election to boot that politician in between elections. Now, referendum laws, which is typically known as citizens' initiative, is very similar. Essentially, if you want to propose a piece of legislation, or you want to axe a piece of bad legislation, then you can start a petition drive. If you collect enough petitions, then you can force that legislation to be voted on in a referendum across a province, across a city, or of course, across a nation, which is what we're hoping that the next Conservative leadership hopeful will bring in, if they're elected prime minister, is a national recall and referendum legislation that we've been pushing for like 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, with those referendums or those legislations as well, I mean, another part of the puzzle too, though, is to make sure that they bring ones in that are workable. That was one of my big disappointments with Premier Kenney, is he promised it, he dragged his feet on it, he waited a long time, then finally put it out, but he set the bar in places where we know damn well that those are not going to be functional, pieces of legislation. A person can't realistically initiate that kind of action.
So, Corey, maybe we might disagree here a little bit, but let me start with the good and the bad, right? Or because there's both. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag what Premier Kenney did. I mean, first, I think it's important to recognize and give kudos where kudos is due. And where the kudos is due is that we do have some form of recall in Alberta, some form of citizens initiative in Alberta. I mean, that's something that guys like you and me have been pushing for a long time, the CTF for 30 years. And another thing that we have to talk about is that another good part of the legislation is that it's extended to the municipal level, right? Because we know, Corey, more than anyone else, that those councillors sitting on city of Calgary, for example, they need to be held accountable outside of elections as well. But to your point, Corey, let's talk about the mixed bag issue. So some of the downfalls. Now, we and myself presented to the committee at the Alberta government, and we were recommending the Alberta government set the recall rules at about 25% of votes cast in the last election. So a lower threshold, to your point, than what Premier Kenney brought in, because they brought in something that was, what was it, about 40% of eligible voters. What we pushed for was 25% of votes cast in the last election, which would have been a little bit easier for citizens to actually hold their politicians accountable.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, I credit where due, as you said. At least if the legislation's already into, then it's easier to amend the existing legislation than starting from scratch. I mean, the principle's there. It's just if we could make the case that the bar is set too high, and there should be a bar. I mean, we don't want frivolous referendums held on everything, or recall initiatives just every time you don't like who got elected. But I think a lot of people don't understand, too. 25% of the votes cast, that's a big chunk of names to get on a piece of paper in a real petition. Some people say, oh, it'll be done easily. No. If you've petitioned before, that's a lot of work. It's got to be serious before you get that.
Well, and that's the type of balance that we were trying to strike, Corey, with a recommendation, right? On the one hand, we wanted type of legislation that actual people can actually use, right? So if their politician gets caught dipping their hands in the taxpayer cookie jar, we wanted a tool that people could actually use to give them a pink slip. But on the other hand, to your point, we also have to strike the balance so that political chaos doesn't ensue and that there's not recalls every other day, which might be entertaining. But of course, that's not how the system would work. Now, one thing I want to point forward, Corey, is that we have seen a lot of success in Canada with recall and with referendums. BC was actually the first province to put in recall and initiative all the way back in 1995. There was one successful recall campaign when they had an MLA who got caught sending fake letters to the editor. And then there was a successful recall campaign that collected enough signatures, and he finally stepped down when the writing was on the wall. But there was also a successful referendum campaign in British Columbia because of this type of legislation. And it was when the BC government bungled the process and tried to raise taxes when trying to harmonize the federal and provincial sales taxes. So that piece of legislation allowed voters to say no to that deal when the government bungled it. But also, we have seen two other examples of referendums that have been very successful, even though they weren't triggered by provincial legislation. Of course, number one, I'm talking about the Calgary bid boondoggle, where the people were able to say no and really fight back against the establishment who wanted to raise taxes and spend money in such a frivolous way on the Calgary Olympics. So very glad that we won that plebiscite. But also in British Columbia, the voters were able to strike down a new transit tax that governments were trying to shove down their throats.
Yeah, I mean, there's successful ones and unsuccessful. I mean, just going all the way south, for an example, though, I guess for politicians, for excuses if they fear it, Gavin Newsom dodged being thrown out of office through a citizens' initiative. And most conservatives weren't too happy to see that happen. But to be fair, as far as democracy goes, he's got a stronger mandate now than ever. He's had to face the electorate yet again. And he made his case well. So, I mean, allowing the citizens to get that chance doesn't mean a doom for the politician necessarily. It can mean a stronger mandate.
Yeah, that's right. And to that point, building on it a little bit, is that you don't need recall campaigns or you don't need an actual recall by-election to really force politicians into behaving better, right? Sometimes the stick is enough. If you know that you might have to face your voters tomorrow rather than 4 years down the road, you're probably more likely to behave a little bit better, right? So there's that incentive built within the recall and referendum type of legislation that should force politicians to actually behave better. Because look, man, if you have to go to the doors tomorrow to sell your case on why you behaved badly, you're probably less likely to behave badly in the first place.
Yeah, no, you don't want to face that. I mean, there's other things you could be doing. Now, something I don't know if this could be legislated. I guess you'd have to worry about the political fallout. But I mean, Alberta had that legislation a long, long time ago. You're probably familiar with it. Social credit was in power, and it looked like a successful one was about to happen. So the government just scrapped the legislation. And how could you prevent that from happening?
Well, Corey, I mean, the only real answer to that is that can happen with any type of legislation, right? That can happen with any type of legislation, but at least then the politicians who did that would have to answer for it in the following election. Let me give you another example. I believe it was Manitoba. Certainly a prairie province where you had some form of Taxpayer Protection Act. They decided to at least water it down or alter it, and they were held accountable big time in the last election. So, I mean, certainly you can make that argument about any piece of legislation. Okay, granted, but at least there's that extra check on the power, right? Right now, essentially, we just have to wait for whenever the next federal election is to be able to give politicians a pink slip. But even let's just put recall legislation to the side. We could have used citizens initiative or referendum legislation. We could have been using that over the last little while. And let me give you some examples. I mean, we have seen the carbon tax go up 3 times during the pandemic. We saw the carbon tax go up again April 1st of this year, while inflation was already sky high. I think there's a case to be made that someone could have launched a citizens initiated referendum to stop those carbon tax hikes. At least now we would have been able to put pressure on the government about their carbon tax. Because remember, Corey, these politicians have not been honest with us at election time about carbon taxes. Remember, before the 2019 election, you had then Environment Minister Catherine McKenna tell voters that the government had no intention to keep raising the carbon tax beyond 11 cents per liter of gas. Then following the election, what happened? Well, Trudeau says now that they had a new mandate, well, we're going to keep raising it all the way up to, 40 cents per liter of gas. So I think that this type of legislation would give people a better tool to actually hold their politicians accountable and to actually get important policy issues on the tables all across Canada.
Yeah, another aspect that needs to be put into the legislations, I think, with these two is not just citizens-initiated referenda, but binding citizens-initiated referenda. Because if there's not a binding clause for it, then still all it is a poll. And even if it might be politically dangerous for a government to do, they could ignore the outcome of a referenda more easily in that case.
Yeah, they could for sure. I mean, they did in Calgary. Remember, that wasn't exactly legally binding. So I totally agree with what you're saying. There needs to be even more strict limits on what politicians can do or not do after a referendum. But even if that's not included, it's still better than not being in, right? But Corey, one thing I do want to circle back to is kind of where you started the conversation off. Like, why is the piece targeting Mr. Poilievre? Of course, we want all parties, all political leaders to run with recall and initiative. But the reason we focused on Mr. Poilievre in this op-ed is because his whole campaign, he's been talking about putting people back in charge, making a Canada where the government is the servant, not the master. He's right when he identifies that there's an accountability problem in Ottawa. But we think that one of the key solutions to that then is, okay, if you want to show that citizens are the boss, then input recall and referendum laws. And so far, we haven't heard him make a firm commitment to this piece of legislation.
Yeah, well, and this is the time to get those commitments. I mean, I guess you can see why they fear making those commitments. It didn't work out very well with Mr. O'Toole on the carbon tax when you guys got his signature on it. But it's important times like now when they're running to get them to make a statement on that. So I imagine you'll keep putting the question to Mr. Poilievre as long as you can.
Yeah, absolutely will. And we do want to get them on the record because, hey, when they lie to Canadians, they get held accountable, right? Unfortunately for Mr. O'Toole, Canadian voters aren't stupid. He said one thing in the leadership race. He broke his promise. He lied to Canadians, and he was held accountable, not just by Canadian voters, but his own caucus as well.
And well, in recall, I mean, it should hold some appeal for people on any end of the spectrum. I mean, if you just look at it on the surface with a good policy. I mean, I know speaking for Calgary City Council in the last two councils, there were a couple of candidates I suspect might have had recall and initiatives brought up against them, or at least attempted. And these were conservative-leaning candidates, not left-leaning ones, but they don't have the mechanism right now either. So they're stuck with these, or we're stuck with one, and are stuck with another until the end of this term.
I completely agree. And I think you're talking, what was it, Councillor Joe Maglioka when he was caught sticking his hands in the taxpayer cookie jar, Corey. I think that's who you might have been referring to.
Yes.
Yeah. But here's the thing, right? A recall and initiative, it's not really a right, it's not really a left type of issue. I mean, you can get any type of policy in a referendum. And when you look at recall usually isn't about a specific policy per se. It tends to happen, these type of recall by-elections tend to happen when you have politicians misusing public trust, right? Or I should say abusing public trust. So for example, in British Columbia, it wasn't a specific policy per se that led to the recall campaign. It was when their MLA was caught sending fake letters to the editor, right? So the recall tool, I think, would be more for making sure politicians aren't abusing the public purse and, quite frankly, just aren't trying to mislead Canadians and mislead taxpayers.
Yeah, well, and as you said, the preventative power potentially anyways, maybe some of these guys would think, okay, well, if I pull this off, I could, have to answer for it because a lot of what happens too is they pull their stunts, but they just hope that the public forgets by the time they get another chance to get to the polls. And the recall is always hopefully at the back of their mind saying, I better keep a clean nose here or we're going to be in trouble.
Hey, and one more thing I need to add, right? We've seen some success here in Canada with recall and initiative. You mentioned the fact that a lot of this happens in the States already. Already about half of the states in the U.S. have either some form of recall or some form of initiative legislation. But also, we found that there's about 19 countries, at least that we've identified, that have some form of recall legislation. Countries similar to us, or at least peers like Japan. You've got Swiss. You've got some Mexican states that also have recall. I believe there is some type of recall process in Germany as well, maybe even at the local level. But then initiative, the referendum legislation, we've identified 36 different countries that have some form of direct democratic process that allows their citizens to influence legislation. You've got Italy where there's something like that. You have New Zealand. And of course, the one that everyone knows about is Switzerland. So I just want to make clear is that there's so many different examples to choose from where you can strike the right balance federally between more accountability and making sure political chaos doesn't ensue.
Yeah, we can't pretend that it's unprecedented or there aren't working examples to go from. Well, I appreciate that, Franco, and thanks for coming on today. Where can people find more information about what you're pushing and encouraging out there in the taxpayers' world.
Well, hey, head over to taxpayer.com, check out our newsroom, sign some petitions, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And Corey, thanks so much for having me on.